Hey everyone! In today's video, I wanted to cover textual inversion. This is something I've covered before in a previous video, but at the time I was kind of dabbling in it, and at this point I wanted to do a much more advanced tutorial showing the steps in the process that I go through to create some of the stuff that I'm going to show off here. And at the same time, I wanted to describe what I've come to understand about models, biases, and a number of things in the world of AI art for those who are interested. But of course, for those who aren't, I'm going to keep things chapter oriented. Description stuff up front and the process and creation of these embeddings and hypernetworks, which are the big topics that we're going to cover today. We'll get to that after I've covered some of these basics. I will say though, in terms of how I use these things, I feel like my understanding of how these things are formed and what I use them for is kind of important if you want some of the results that you're seeing here. As a disclaimer, I'm not really an expert. I just use this stuff. So I'm going to go off of what I've seen and how I've used it. The first thing that we want to think about with embeddings or with hypernetworks is that we're basing them off of a specific model. So we're going to be using 1.4, 1.5, or something like 2.0, 2.1. Whatever you decide to use, it's important to remember which one you pick, because your output may not be universally compatible. For our example, and honestly my preference is to use models 1.4 or 1.5, we're going to use this line and we're going to call this the baseline. And along this baseline, we have the different words, the different concepts. I'm just going to call those things. A model is basically a database, and it's separated into words just like this, or different concepts. It's not exactly a one-to-one, but that's kind of the best way to think about it. It's certainly not a straight line, but this is the best way that I can show it to you. By supplying our own images to the model, textual inversion lets us output things that look more like that. So we're creating our own biases. You've already heard that models are biased, so we're just going to further influence those existing biases. And because we're not creating an entirely new model, we're going to be saving a ton of space. Embeddings are actually quite shareable. They're very, very small as a PNG web graphic. So you could email them, share it in your Discord, whatever you want. A hypernetwork is probably a little bit harder to share, but we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both here. Now, they do vary in how you use them, but pound for pound, hypernetworks are way more powerful. They're almost too powerful in a sense, where you may need to dial it back after a small amount of training with even just a really limited amount of pictures. But the good news is you can dial it back in the prompt. You can set things as, 20% power and things like that. They also, and this is just based on my experience, they seem to train faster, in a sense where you can get much better results with a lot less training. With embeddings, there are times where I've had to retrain it, or I've had to train it more times in a different way to get better results. However, I think it's important to define how we're using these things, because each of them have different use cases, and they can be used together. A hypernetwork is either on or off, and you can turn up or down how powerful it is. Whereas an embedding is an actual piece of the prompt. You're adding something to the tree over there. A new dot, so to speak, and we're creating influences around that sometimes. So if your embedding name is my_word, you would use that within your prompt. So in this way, embeddings are more powerful, but in a different way, because you can use them in part of the prompt as an object, as a person, as a concept, as many different things. That's why this tutorial is going to be pretty open in terms of what you can use this stuff for. I'm just going to show you how to create the tokens. Especially with embeddings, it seems like your training input mixed with the prompts you give it and the settings that you use can really give you some wild output. They just feel easier and more natural to use in a normal prompt, like we're used to. When we're trying to create a bias towards something, we have to ask ourselves what we want things to look more and more like. With hypernetworks, again, you're going to get a lot more, a lot faster, so you kind of have to ask yourself like how much you want to do and how wild you want the output, how random. Embeddings, in my experience, have just been a lot more fun. All right, now biases. Let's talk about biases, what they are, what we're actually influencing. And when we're talking about biases within a model, we're talking about visual biases, biases towards certain things, whether that's a color palette, saturation level, the framing, a pose, the type of face structure that somebody has. The more we have it focus on whatever we're giving it, the more the output is going to look a lot like that stuff, whether it's a bunch of faces, the same person. So if you're trying to capture the essence of something, whether it's a person's face or whether it's a style or just kind of a vibe, well, I mean, there are other options, but this is a great starting point. And if you do already have yourself a Dream Booth model that's flavored in a certain way to make certain images or things like that, you can easily combine that with an embedding, a hypernetwork, as long as they have a similar model version number. You know, a Dream Booth model based on 1.5 is going to be compatible with a 1.5 token, at least as far as I've seen. All right, hopefully this makes sense if you've been following along. I know the screen is an absolute mess at this point, but we're using image input to influence the faces or poses or the framing or the saturation or one of a million different things that could be part of what make up, you know, quote unquote vibe or style. Or in the case of a hypernetwork, when we're really just trying to capture something hyper realistic. But one important thing to understand in both cases is we're not just giving it an image, we're also giving it prompt. We're giving it at least one word to associate the image with. And again, with embeddings, we're also adding a new word of our own. One of my first and most successful embeddings was my_AI, which is based on a folder full of AI generated art. She's completely recognizable to me at this point, and she's a recurring character in a lot of my thumbnails and things like that. But she doesn't exist. She's just a digital token. Learning that I could train based solely on AI generated output was huge because this meant you could train in stages. Not only could you influence your biases, but you could continue to do so, further and further pushing the limits of what you want to create. The very first thing we need is photos, and the higher quality, the crisper, better resolution, the better. And whatever it is you're trying to emulate, you're probably going to want many more examples than what I've got here. I'm just doing this for the purpose of showing how it works. Just like the first time I talked about it, you're going to want to head to beerme.net. And this is a great website for just dropping the photos here, however many you have, all at once. And you can resize, crop them all at the same time. This website supports a ton of different formats, so you could have a whole folder full of a mix of different files, rename them all at the same time. It's great for all that stuff. Feel free to experiment with different sizes and settings later, but everything I've ever done has been at 512 by 512, so that's the way that I've kept it. I do output as JPEG, and there's no reason really not to do it as 100% quality. I've never been that hard up for space. Note as I do the rename here, you want to make sure you have this -XXX. You can put a file number and then save it as a zip file. You're going to need these at least temporarily for training, so remember wherever you extract them to, but go ahead and extract them into a folder. Depending on your options and extensions, everyone's startup process is going to look a little bit different. But one thing we're about to create together is an embedding, and it's going to create a permanent fixture here. You're going to notice a long list of embeddings that I have installed on my own right now. In the Stable Diffusion Web UI, there's a project folder specifically for embeddings, and these are tiny files. You can share them back and forth with your friends. So if you do create one that you want to get rid of, it's not permanent at all. You can actually just delete it. And hypernetworks are basically the same deal. You'll find a folder full of those inside your models folder once you've made a few. All right, so let's get started. We'll create the embedding and we'll create a hypernetwork, and then we'll train them one at a time. You shouldn't need any special extensions for this. You should have a train tab at the top with the default installation of the web UI. So go ahead and click on that, and we're going to keep it to as many default settings as possible. This whole thing is to demonstrate how to do it. You can tweak these settings to your liking. In Create Embedding, we're going to use the name my_test_embed. And we're doing that because we want it to be completely unique. You want to make sure that you're not adding on to something else in the model, or you're really going to screw up your idea. For initialization text, I've always copied and pasted or just retyped the word and left the star in place. Whatever we put for the initialization word is what we're going to use to prompt for our embedding when we want it. Embeddings tend to be a little bit more verbose, so you'll actually get output in a couple of places. Next, we're going to do the same thing with a hypernetwork. We're going to keep all of the default settings. You don't have to be nearly as careful here with the name, so feel free to give it whatever name you like. When you hit the create button here, just don't expect to get a lot of output. Whenever I've hit the button here, I've never gotten any kind of output, so don't worry if that happens. That's normal. I did also want to point out that I'm using my tank mix model, which is based on the 1.5. So I'm aware that everything that I'm creating is really only going to be compatible with 1.5 models. Next, we're going to go into Preprocessing Images. And you're going to find that this tool could have also cropped images and potentially resized them as well, but probably wouldn't have given you as fine of control as BeerMe gave you. My apologies for giving you a better option. What we really want this for is for blip, which is going to analyze these images and give you a corresponding text file that has a description of what it thinks the image looks like. It does a decent job, but we're going to correct it for any kind of errors, and you're going to get a chance to see what Stable Diffusion thinks of your pictures. You can also feel free to explore some of these other options later. Deep Buru, for example, provides a text file very similar to Blip, but it's more just a list of adjectives or tags separated by commas. You can have it output a duplicate flipped image if you need, I guess, more training data, but from the exact opposite pose. So a lot of stuff there, but we're only going to use Blip. We just need to put in a source directory. For the destination directory, we could put in the same thing with a letter next to it, and it'll create the directory when we hit the button. If this will be the very first time that you've run anything like this, it may download something before it runs the Blip process, but Blip is very quick, and almost instantly you should see a new folder pop up with some text files. Hopefully Stable Diffusion was nicer to you than it has been to me in the past, or looking at pictures that I've submit, but at this point you can check out the descriptions that you got in return. Anyway, this process is great if you want to feel self-conscious. And I should probably warn you about that upcoming process too, because the training and seeing a lot of photos of yourself coming up, you may notice that Stable Diffusion tends to make a caricature out of your character. So prepare to have any flaws accentuated. You know, if you have any. Depending on how many images you brought to the table, this may be a lengthy process, but it's worthwhile. So it's definitely worth checking each of your images and the descriptions that follow. For example, it thought my tortilla blanket was a cat, which it's clearly not, so I corrected it. In a case like that, you just want to save the file and move on. I know we're moving fast and you're like, whoa, partner, we just met, but we're about to train our first Hypernetwork together. Let's head back into the training space, and in your Hypernetwork downward selector, go ahead and select whatever the heck you named it. We're going to start with this one because it's the simplest one to set up, surprisingly. The dataset directory, you want to make sure you're using that output folder with the images that also has the files with it. You also have a pull down for prompt template that you want to grab, and you want to select hypernetwork.txt. These are templates that are set up, and we'll explain that a little bit more in detail for the embeddings, but for now, go ahead and select Hypernetwork, leave everything else by itself. While default settings have made sense for most things, I've never understood why 100,000 steps is the default here for max steps. You definitely want to drop that down, because especially with a Hypernetwork, you're going to see pretty instantaneous results. For our purposes, let's go ahead and put it at 10,000, and we're going to interrupt whenever we want to. Every 500 steps, it's going to kick out a sample image, and we're going to be able to see what it's got cooking. One of the best things with this training process is it's very easy to just interrupt and restart. As a general rule, it's easier to add more and more than it is to stop and go back. And in my experience, it does seem possible to overtrain. You can keep an eye on the output though, and just cancel whenever you like, which will give you a really good idea of the type of image output. When you mess with the other settings, especially the one that reads the prompt directly from whatever you have set up in text to image, you can get some really fine-tuned results, but for our purposes, we're just going to use the random default settings and make it really easy for everybody. As I mentioned before, Hypernetworks do train faster, so it's going to make less heat, but any kind of training process, and you should know this from making images in general, it's going to make some heat. So be nice to your video card, don't blow it up. Now you've already seen the kind of prompts that are being used here for the Hypernetwork, so the output is a sample graphic with that prompt, and the Hypernetwork being applied. Now remember, we can interrupt this at any time and do some testing, but for now, we're just going to let it run. We'll wait until we get a sample image that looks something like me. It doesn't take very long at all. The sample image after just 1,000 steps, with just these 3 images, was pretty impressive in my opinion. What you'll be able to see later is that this is just picture of a man, and the Hypernetwork is a thing that we're adding on top of it. Later on, you'll be able to generate a photo with picture of a man or picture of a whatever you're creating, and you can turn up or down your Hypernetwork or turn it on or off, and you'll be able to see what your Hypernetwork essentially does to a photo. The words you're seeing in the prompt, these are the individual words within the model that your Hypernetwork is going to influence. And how strong your Hypernetwork is based on what you're training it, what your training material is, how long you train it for, a number of different factors. You'll be able to choose when and where to use it, and you can slightly alter the strength. Once your network has made enough progress that you want to give it a test, go ahead and interrupt it, and then head over to text to image. If you click the pink looking button underneath generate, you should open up your styles and you should see your Hypernetwork loaded. If you don't see it, just hit reload, and you may see it pop up. I will say there have been times where I've had to close and reopen the program completely, and it may be best practice to do that after training anyway. Regardless, within the prompt, this is how you can call on a hypernetwork and get it to fire off. With the simple text prompt of just the word man and the hypernetwork being applied at 100% power, here's the type of output we were able to get. I left all the settings very visible so you can see for yourself, and you can see it's not perfect. In fact, far from it. But we can use this image and this seed to continue to see what happens. And to get it started back up, we just flip back over to the training tab and start it up. As long as I was the one to interrupt the process, I've never had an issue with embeddings or with hypernetworks getting started back up. And if you reach the total max steps, you can just add more. I really like the output at 1500 steps, and I thought it looked really good. As long as you don't close the browser, it's real easy to test these changes back and forth too. And if we compare apples for apples, again, we can use that same image, the same seed, and we can see what biases the hypernetwork influences directly. Using the PNG info tab on your test photo, you can grab the settings, the prompt, all the hypernetwork details. I'm not actually quite sure if a photo that somebody else generated that they used their hypernetwork for, if my web UI would pick up on that and throw it into the prompt, or where that info is actually stored. But anyway, you can grab it. You can grab your own data very easily, rerun the same diffusion with the hypernetwork now being applied at its new strength, and hopefully you'll be able to see a clear difference back and forth. Remember, this was 1500 steps, this was just 3 photos, you saw the process, and the better input you can give this process, the better output hopefully you should be able to get out of this process. And hopefully that gives you an idea of how the hypernetwork system works. But of course, if there's any clarification needed, hit me up in the Discord or in the comments below. Now we are basically set up to do embeddings already. All the hard stuff is already done, but we do need to wrap our heads around a concept. Flipping back over to train, let's go ahead and set up our embedding to my_test_embed like we set up before. Embeddings typically need a little bit more training than hypernetworks, but I don't know if we're going to train the whole thing out. I just want to give you an understanding of how it works. Because just like the hypernetwork, we're going to stop whenever we're ready to stop. But before we can get started, we need to wrap our heads around a concept. With an embedding, you have to ask yourself before you make it, the pictures of the thing that I'm trying to kind of emulate, is it the subject of the pictures that I'm trying to emulate? Or is it the style of the pictures that I'm trying to emulate? Because that hypernetwork.txt thing was set up and there was just one of those, but there's 4 choices when it comes to embeddings. And we've got style, style plus file words, subject, and subject plus file words. Think about how you would want to use an embedding within your prompt. And then, how many words do you want that connected to within the model? Those are your file words. How many different biases are you trying to affect? This requires a little bit of experimentation. I would highly recommend you play with this. It's a lot of fun, actually. You can make some really interesting art. Again, is it the subject or is it the style of your prompt? Is it art by this embedding, or is it a picture of this embedding, or somebody wearing this embedding? That type of idea. In our case, for our test run, and since we're only using 3 images, I'm just going to use subject plus file words. And we'll hope that Stable Diffusion can capture a face with just a few images like what we have. Embeddings seem to take in information a little bit differently, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Because they're fun, funny, and wild, I turned down the required amount of steps before we get a sample image, so every 200 cycles we're going to see a new image here. Sped up to even 1000x, you can see how very quickly Stable Diffusion looks at my face and interprets me as a clown, and very quickly accentuates certain characteristics in my clown-like face, making me more and more clown-like over time. And as we see more of these pictures emerge, I really want to stop this process, and as the editor, knowing that I could stop this process, I'm wondering why I didn't. I've already made a bunch of embeddings with more data, so I just kind of had a let it ride mentality if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, just like with hypernetworks, you can click the pink button under Generate. You can see a list of your embeddings. You may or may not need to reboot. Probably a good idea to do so, but as soon as you start testing with this, you'll be able to see how it works within a prompt. And you can test it in a different prompt in different ways. You can amp it up, turn it down. I've also found that with more sampling steps, sometimes I'll get much better output from embeddings. But your mileage may vary. It really depends on what you put into it and how you prompt it. I didn't really pick these specific training photos because they were a good choice, really just as an example. But I did run some extensive tests behind the scenes with a larger training data set, and this is what that looks like. Specifically going against my own advice of being nice to your video card, and I ran, I believe it was 20,000 training steps with those specific photos on each of the 4 different potential types of embeddings to give you some example output. So using that group of photos, mostly with just my face, these are examples of what it looks like when the token is trained as the subject of the prompt. But if we instead try to draw on the style of the photos, maybe the pose, maybe my facial structure, those types of elements, this is what the embedding becomes. In my opinion and in my experience, style has been really where embeddings have been a lot more useful and fun for me. You can combine them with hypernetworks a little bit easier, and if you do have a Dream Booth flavored model, you can really let it shine this way. If you start to think outside of the box, there's a lot of ways you can build on your own output. It's even possible to start training on one set of data and then switch it up and change to a completely different data set to start influencing different biases within the same embedding. There's a lot of different options. Anyway, I hope this video answered a lot of questions for people who might have been stuck on something or maybe curious about something. But most importantly, I hope a lot of you are able to create new and awesome stuff with this knowledge. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I missed. Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And as always, I appreciate your time here with me. Thanks for watching.